Professor Chomsky, South Africa apartheid system took 30 years basically for it to end, and the BDS movement was important, the boycott, divestment, sanctions. In respect to Israel, that movement began, as I understand, in 2005. Okay, so have you endorsed that movement, and would you boycott products manufactured or made only in the settlements or in all of Israel?
Well, let's first of all take a look at South Africa, because it's important to understand it. It's a good analogy. And there's a lot, it's very clear what happened there. You go back to 1960. In 1960, the apartheid regime, which really was just being established, recognized that it was going to become an international pariah. And we have the records now. The South African foreign minister called in the American ambassador, 1960 I think it was, and told him that, look, we're becoming an international pariah. Everybody's voting against us in the UN. And it looks bad, but he said, look, you and I know that there's only one vote in the United Nations, yours. And as long as you support us, it doesn't make any difference what the rest of the world does. Okay, that was the assumption. It turned out to be right. If you take a look at that, the next 30 years, the U.S. continued to support South Africa. Reagan had to even violate congressional sanctions to support South Africa. And he had a reason, he had a pretext. The pretext was, remember that the war on terror was not declared by Bush, it was declared by Reagan. When Reagan came in 1981, his administration declared that the centerpiece of American policy will be a war on terror, state-directed international terrorism, plague of the modern age, on and on. And that was the pretext for destroying Central America and for supporting South Africa. In 1988, that late, the Washington administration declared that the African National Congress was one of the more notorious terrorist groups in the world. So therefore we had to defend apartheid against terror. That's 1988. In fact, Mandela just got off the terrorist list 2 years ago. It's the first time he can come to the United States without a special dispensation. Well, that takes us through 1988. Okay, by then, corporations were pulling out of South Africa. The UN had declared an arms embargo. The boycott, the BDS movement actually began around 1980. At that time, there was overwhelming opposition to apartheid, no support for it in Congress, in the business world. In fact, the only support was in the White House, literally. But so yeah, then it was an effective movement. But remember the circumstances, and it took years before finally, we don't have the documents yet, but around 1990, roughly, the U.S. policy shifted. Mandela was allowed out of Robbins Island, and within 3 years, the apartheid system had collapsed. So the foreign minister was correct back in 1960. There is only one vote in the United Nations. That's ours. And as long as the U.S. supported apartheid, it looked triumphant. By the late 80s, they were exuberant. They had crushed the internal resistance. They were continuing to prosper despite the sanctions. They looked victorious until the U.S. shifted its position. Okay, and then it shifted. And what happened afterwards is interesting to look at, but at least the apartheid system collapsed. All right, now let's take a look at Israel. Are we in anything like the circumstances of 1980? No, not even remotely. We're not in for much of the world, yes, but not in the United States. In the United States, it's not the case that in the United States corporations are pulling out of Israel because they can't stand the occupation. It's not the case that Congress is passing sanctions, quite the opposite. It's not the case that there's an arms embargo. There is a call for it. It's not coming from the BDS movement, incidentally. It's coming from the human rights groups. It doesn't get published, but it's there. So Amnesty International, for example, a couple of years ago, they called for an arms embargo. That's way beyond what the BDS movement does. The human withdraw any support, economic support for Israel that's in any way involved in the settlements or in discrimination within Israel. Okay? They have also called on the U.S. government to investigate the tax-free status of groups in the United States, like say the Jewish National Fund, which are involved either in any way in the settlements or in discrimination in Israel. Well, that's pretty strong. But so far, that's just, it's so marginal it doesn't even make the press. Okay? It's not like South Africa in 1980. There has to be a big educational campaign before these things become meaningful. You want to call for a boycott, you have to get people to understand what you're doing. Okay, in the case of South Africa in 1980, it was easy. The work had been done. In the case of Israel, the work has to be done. You can't just say, okay, let's boycott them. If you do and people don't understand what you're calling for, that just elicits a backlash.
Would you make that your next book, in terms of writing about the BDS movement?
I've written about it for years. In fact, I was involved in the BDS movement before, but years before it was officially started. But what I've been pointing out in the BDS movement, they can't seem to understand it, is that BDS is a tactic, right? Like civil disobedience, it's a tactic. You don't do it because it's between you and God. I mean, some people do, but I don't. You do it because you think it's going to be tactically effective. And that means you have to estimate, like any tactic, what's the effect going to be on the audience you're trying to reach. Okay? If the effect on the audience you're trying to reach is, well, I'm taking a strong step, so maybe it'll awaken other people to do something, okay, that's good. If the effect on the audience is just anger, why are you doing this? It's just anti-Semitism. Why don't you pick on somebody else? If that's the effect, it's a bad tactic. And anybody who's involved in activism is somebody's second nature. When you make tactical decisions, and that's what you do all the time, if you're serious about it, you have to ask what the consequences are going to be. If the consequences are going to be to make things worse, you don't do it because it's a principle. Now, part of the problem with the BDS movement is it's kind of irrational. It's become like a catechism. We've got to do it, not considering what the consequences are. Well, sometimes it makes sense, like boycotting products from the settlements. That makes a very good sense, and you can explain to people in ways that make them understand it. That's why Human Rights Watch is calling for it. The same with discrimination in Israel. On the other hand, when you say, let's boycott Tel Aviv University, the immediate reaction is, why don't you boycott Harvard? They have much worse record. unless you've created the basis for that, you have no answer. So that's the problem that the BDS movement is facing, I think. You can't let tactics become a cult. You have to recognize that tactics are tactics, and you have to think carefully about what the consequences are going to be, and you have to kind of select them and hone them, shape them, so they'll have the right consequences. That's not easy, but that's like 99% of what activists are doing all the time, thinking about how to work out your tactics so they'll have the right effect. It's not enough just to have a formula.
Thank you. Sharon.